Hello, everyone. Welcome to Season 8 of Bios and Bookmarks, powered by the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. I am Shivanee Ramlochan, Bios and Bookmarks Project Manager. And my goodness, it's been a while since we've seen all of you. I hope the year in books and in reading has been treating you well. As you know, here at Bios and Bookmarks, we remain interested in wild, experimental, and transgressive literatures coming from the Caribbean. So we thought this season, to keep in that spirit and perhaps even elevate it, we would introduce a slightly spicy theme: the complexity of Caribbean love. As we know, love in all its multiple forms abounds in our islands, from the carnal to the domestic, from the spiritual to the psychological. But what makes Caribbean love unique? Here, in our very first episode of Season 8, to help answer that question, is none other than Saida Agostini, who I'm delighted to welcome for the first time to the NGC Bocas Lit Fest family. Saida, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with y'all.
Saida's going to talk to us today about her debut collection of poems, Let the Dead In. And before I invite her to read, let me introduce her to you properly. Her first collection of poems, Let the Dead In, was a finalist for the Center of African American Poetry and Poetics 2020 Book Prize, as well as a New Issues Poetry Prize. She is the author of Stunt, Neon Hemlock, October 2020, a chapbook exploring the history of Nellie Jackson, a Black woman entrepreneur who operated a brothel for 60 years in Natchez, Mississippi. Her poetry can also be found in the Black Ladies Brunch Collective's anthology, Not Without Our Laughter, Barrel House Magazine, Hobart Pulp, Plume, and other publications. And on a personal note, I had the privilege of reading this collection earlier this year and reviewing it. And I was, as you'll hear in our discussion, following Saida's reading, blown away by the intermingling of folklore, history, psychology, faith, resistance, and Black queer signifying that populates this collection. So I am extraordinarily excited for this reading and to have Saida here to share it with us. Saida, I'd love to hear your first reading if you're ready.
I'm ready. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with y'all. I'm going to share some poems on the theme of Caribbean love. I'm going to start with, which is actually the first poem, which is also the opening to my book, Let the Dead In. Where does the story start? With outrageous grief, so luscious, so rare, we'll keep it for generations. Bring it out at the finest of dinners, plant it in fields and thresh its stalks at night. It starts with a ring of jeweled mermaids, beckoning great Uncle Harold from solid ground to a golden city submerged in shining black water, his wife weeping and weeping at the shores among his rough nets, Harold's boat empty and rollicking in the middle of a river, him rising after 7 days towards the Pomeroon sun, pulled up wailing by Scale's lovely arms. It starts with the Jambi, dead slave children hungry for friends, pining in the winds behind Great Granny's house, drawn to salt in fevers of blue fire. It starts with broken glass, the surprise of blood in a wife's waiting mouth, my great-grandfather's hand curled in a fist. It starts with a riot of stubborn love, more drunk than the pastor at my baptism. with one lie, then another, until a whole world is born and we wait a revolt of Black girls. So, being Guyanese and writing poems about my family and family history, my mother asked me, like, why are you writing this work again? And so I tried to write a few poems in answer, which I'll share here with y'all today. This is called I Write of My Mother in the Book of Joy. Most evenings finds Mummy pacing down cooling paths in a blaze of blossom. Nothing that lived in Guyana can be nursed here. So instead, her resistance is found in the bud of hydrangeas, gladiolas, and the love of hummingbirds. The most common of flowers will be tended. During the summer, she glories in the rightness of blooming, dedicating hours to pulling errant weeds that choke the root. Even in winter, she is pledged to nursing life in the bitterest of Maryland snow. Think on the 4 lime trees sheltering in our house by the dining table, forcing my blustering father to cower at least for a short while in its branches. Neighbors come by to exclaim at the impossible orchard reared among wood-planked walls. My mummy, the stubborn farmer, laughing proudly by its fruits, requests for advice returned with exacting directions on wind, sun, and timing. Yet, when my sister and I hear her, what we think of are 2 little girls reared less gently than this. Her, a young, lonely mother with sometimes brutal hands. But here I am, crying at the lesson of her bowed back in the garden, hands dug into a mire of dirt, stubbornly willing love into life. My great-grandmother comes from a river village in Guyana called Kabakaburi off of the Pomeroon River, which is this huge black river. We always called it Coca-Cola water. And this is the story that of my great-grandmother's last night on this earth. Great-granny's last night. Beyond her window, she can hear the strains of men leaving the fields, singing in anticipation of another night, sweet with food and women, their faces tender with sweat, ringed in mud, hands gripping machetes, blades slung upwards towards a dimming sun. Her pipe lays packed and unsmoked by her bed, clean sheets huddled round her, cups of milky tea and weeping held quiet in the next room. Granny will tell me all she saw that night. Death, a great horned thing, sitting side by side with God in one small cramped room by a huge dark river. The birds cawing in blue ecstasy, Elvis's Love Me Tender played on repeat until even the record player begs for relief. The pick worn down with playing lyrics so tired they can't help but be real. Elvis in a glittery jumpsuit and heels wailing, "For my darling, I love you." And when he hits that high note, pulls away the mic, crooning, "Love me true," even death and God dance together. Weep in each other's embrace, smiling for an old woman, losing breath as the time bears down. She says, "I just need him to forgive one last ting." Made her body a confession, hands stretched out in the air towards a white road filled with flowers, fruit, and light. No work or babies to deliver, just liming and a shining, laughing death, ready to deliver her, a scrawling, wrinkly child. So I'm going to share 2 more poems with y'all before we close out this section. This was the final answer I was able to give my mother on why I was writing about all of our family business. And it's called Notes on Archiving Family Erasure. And there's an epigraph from my family member in my head, James Baldwin. Love does not begin and end the way we think it does. Love is a battle, love is a war, love is a growing up. When I say I love my family, what I mean is I worship the battle. You can't wish away creation or reorder blood. Childishly, I thought we could retell stories. I mean to say, I can't lie. In truth, there are wretched days I call my sister and ask, was this real? Did this happen? She says nothing. Part of love can be called refusing to answer. My mother says, let things lie. She means murder it. Let our shame be a suffocating vine. We were made to believe that everything we bore was ugly, a family of shell-shocked gods fleeing their own clay. Yet, I will come back to the door of our own home, sit at its steps, and fall in love with the order of our creation, the seasons it took to urge kindness into our natures, how we won glory even as the city fell. I'm going to share one more poem with y'all before we close out. This is probably one of my favorite poems I've ever written, and it's called Two Fat Black Women Are Making Love. And the joke is right there, ready, shuddering, and alive, rife with promise. There are so many paths that have been worn out for a quick, easy laugh. Tyler Perry strutting with a gun and wig, screaming rotund and loud like a Medea would. Martin calling out your mama on television, or the meme of a young woman shot underhand, her belly in love with a tight skirt, hands moving towards an open mouth. Look at everything she devours. Imagine it. Does it make you hungry too? Two fat Black women are making love on a bed on the floor, and they are weeping for joy. They are crying, great folds of flesh, flushing and shaking. One cannot look in the mirror save for thinking of her daddy. All this ugly and skinned together counts the men who say they hate her body as they do bitter cops and dead Black boys. Two fat Black women are making love, and they touch each other like they can hold it. Honeyed, profane, body, like patriots, like their bodies have never been folded into freezers, screamed at on streets, coaxed or threatened, sweet, like they have names, like we will know them. Thank you.
Wow, thank you for that
Thank you.
thrilling and moving reading, Saida. It's always a revelation when one gets to hear the poems embodied by the person who wrote them and the person who lived them to varying degrees. And as we enter our discussion of Let the Dead In, I've I've written several notes, but one of the first lines of poetry of yours that I wrote while reading was from the poem What I Am Afraid of, where you say, or the speaker of the poem says, I know love to be a wound that you pack and pack. There's a way in which your debut is navigating incredible love against and alongside furious kinds of violence. And in the balancing or the unbalancing of these two, I wanted to know what act of love or of violence was your way into writing the collection?
Thank you for that question. You know, I think for me, it's both an act of violence and an act of love. The act of violence, I think, is being both a survivor of child sexual abuse at 6, and also being a survivor of domestic violence and being in an abusive relationship that nearly ended my life. And the love, I think, that is coupled with that is remembering how my mother held me, right, when she found out, remembering um, that it took her time too to understand or process that her daughter had been hurt, right? Um, and when I finally was of an age where I could say to her, this really hurt me, right? And had the ability to find the words to articulate that pain, she just loved me and just made space for me to talk about it. And I think that, we don't often talk enough about kind of the healing power of Black love, and all of the ways I think I've seen my family kind of stretch and push themselves to comprehend what it means to have, like, a Black queer fat poet. When all they wanted was a nice Guyanese girl to, who was going to be an engineer and marry a nice Guyanese boy and have some nice, some nice children. And kind of all of the ways that it's pushed and stretched my family, and also pushed and stretched me to reconceptualize how I defined love, you know?
Thank you for that answer. I mean, love is ever present in these poems, and it's not ever a flat or a pallid love. And that, in fact, I think the speakers of these poems work very hard to show their readers that the roots of both obsession and devotion, of both history and an attempt to flee that history, run very deep. And some of the roots in this collection are not by accident mired in Guyana. There is a strong sense of place that emanates from several of the poems, and not just of an amorphous Guyana, but a very specific geographical location that is full of encounters with the family home, both fractured and harmonious, both blending support and devoid of support, both maternally fierce, and neglectfully paternal. What was it like invoking the placehood of the Guyana specific to you, not just an amorphous Guyana in these poems?
Mm-hmm. I think it's always interesting being, a daughter of Afro-Guyanese immigrants in the United States, right? And having this really, I think I was raised with this very, very strong identity of being both a Black woman and also knowing that, like, my family came from somewhere else, right? Recognizing that because of enslavement and colonialism, we all kind of like hail the continent of Africa as where we're from. And also at the same time, like, recognizing that so much of my sense of place came from Guyana, it came from Georgetown, it came from Kabakaburi, and recognizing kind of the roots in that. I think, for me, the reason why Guyana has always felt so important, is because I think my parents had a sense of freedom that they don't necessarily have access to, right, in the United States. Like, they're both documented here. They've both done really, really well. And also at the same time, right, the way in which Blackness is policed and violated in the United States doesn't necessarily always mirror the ways that my parents speak about Blackness in Guyana, right? And while I would never presume to be able to know about all of those complications being born in the United States, it gave me a very different perspective of what it might have been like for me to be raised in Georgetown, where the biggest statue in the entire city is that of Cuffy, right? This enslaved man who led one of the largest slave revolts in the entire Caribbean. And I think knowing that, like, I have that kind of lineage made me really, really proud from a young age. And it also made me hungry to know more. I think one of the things that felt really important to me is particularly thinking back to where my maternal grandmother is from, Kabakaburi, is going back there and, and learning like, oh, actually my grandmother was literally born on the river in a boat in front of the village, right? And going to the graveyard where we have several generations of family members buried, knowing that in the United States, not only do I not have access to that, but that's actually a huge privilege, given kind of the erasure of Black histories and narratives. And I think for me, like documenting and naming and claiming those spaces became even more important to me, because it gave me a sense of connection to a place that wasn't just like, oh, we're from Africa. It's like, no, actually we have these connections and these roots here that gave me a place to come back to and a place to remember and honor my dead.
That's that investment in one's own history, as you just so powerfully shared, is always complex as a Caribbean person who usually, no matter their signification, is straddling multiple identities
Mm-hmm.
at once, trying to make room for various facets of the self, whether they live in the geographical Caribbean or its diaspora. And there is a real rhythm of self discovery, of self knowing through history in these poems. And in that sense, they are unabashedly confessional. They name the names, they go to all the places that politeness and decorum are told not to go. And I believe any kind of poet or writer who does this work invariably, in the act of this sharing, does risk something in doing it. Do you think that's a fair assessment? And if anything was risked in your practice, in your personal life, do you feel that the poems made it worth it?
Yeah. I can't speak to whether or not the poems made it worth it, but I will say this: it's worth it for my own ability to love myself and love my family better. Um, I come from a lineage of Black, Indigenous people that have experienced so much violence, right? There's just no way around it. We're talking about state violence, we're talking about, domestic violence, like all of these different pieces, sexual violence. And my experience has been is that, no one wants to talk about these things, right? But when we don't talk about the things that we have survived out of shame, we also lose all of our ability to celebrate the fact that we have made it and come to a different place because of it, right? I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the ways in which my grandmothers, right? And my great grandmothers and my great grandfathers, found ways to like navigate and survive poverty and violence, and also had this hope that their children would have better lives. Now, there were a lot of sacrifices along the way, and those sacrifices showed up in their ability to access love and acceptance for their children or even for their partners, right? I mean, my great grandmother, there's a picture of my great great grandmother, but to this day, I don't know my great great grandmother's name, even though we have this photo, because every time my great grandmother was asked about her, she would just weep. The emotion, the grief was too strong. Now, I can tell you what the rumor is. The thought is perhaps my great great grandmother was killed by her partner, my great great grandfather. And so, my great grandmother just literally could not manage the grief of talking about her. But what that means is that I've lost access to another piece of my history. And so, one of the things I'm profoundly grateful for is I got a grant to go back to Guyana, and both of my parents came with me. My grandmother, who ended up passing away last year, was there with me as well, and they traveled with me to the villages we grew up in, Mahika, Golden Grove, and I got to see my family, not just as like these people that took care of me, but as full human beings, as adult to adult. And it gave me the ability to love them better than I had ever done before, because I became grateful for understanding that if it wasn't for what they went through, even if daddy struggles with who I am today, I am here and I'm able to be this Black queer woman and be open about who I am because of everything that he did before me.
There's there's often a invocation made to Caribbean women writers to document their survival in whatever form that takes, to speak about resilience and fortitude and the power of a often quiet and unassuming strength. And the work that exists in our literary canon that does this is by no means unimportant. But the work that you do does this and more than this. It is an insistence, as you say in a beautiful sundress blog interview, on a naked and unabashed commitment to our erotic selves. The idea that poetry can be an act of untaming, of reclaiming from orthodoxy everything we've been denied. So I'd love to hear more about your pathways to writing joy, desire, and a pride of self reclamation beyond the strictures of the Black Caribbean female body as resilient and simply surviving.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. I mean, I think, it's so interesting, right? Like when we talk about this archetype of like quiet survival, resilience, because I don't know about you, but I have never met anyone in my family or the Guyanese community who was ever quiet about anything. Like there's not a practice of reticence, right? And like we lime loud, we grieve loud, all of these things we do loudly. So why would we hold pleasure in? Right. And so, for me, as I think about my work, I remember when I first started to kind of write these poems, I did have this sense of like, oh, well, I want to be accepted by like the white gaze, I want to be published by these journals. And it's not real poetry if it's like revelatory, right? It's not real poetry if I curse or I'm just real loud about who I am or loud in my pleasure, but seeing, I think, Caribbean writers who challenge that tradition, right? Whether or not we're talking about Rajiv Mohabir or Malika Booker, right? All of these brilliant folks who were like, no, I'm gonna be who I am. and challenge, and like, I don't actually care whether or not you can accept it. I'm just gonna be it, right? And so, I think that shows up in my work because I don't want to be in a world where I don't have pleasure. I don't. And there's been so many of the things that I take pleasure in, whether or not it's the fact that like I get to call my granny at 97 and hear her tell me that she loves me more, or whether it's like, holding my wife and kissing her, all of these things, like I want to celebrate in my work, and some of it is, body, right? Like, so, whether or not it's an ode to a dildo or me imagining Harriet Tubman being lovers with Sojourner Truth, or sometimes it's just simply, talking, as I wrote in my poem, about like imagining great granny's final day on this earth. Like there's a joy in that, right? And like the last thing I'll say about this is that, I was overcome when I first saw my book because I was thinking about the fact that like coming from Black and Indigenous people, we didn't have the right to read. We didn't have the right, or if we knew how to read, we couldn't be out about it, right? And here I am, a big woman, to quote my daddy, 40 years old, and I have a book of like my stories. That's something that no one can take away from me. That in itself, like, is the biggest joy and pleasure that I have, is like I'm able to put my mark on my world. And that's what I want for all of us, that kind of irrevocable sense of like our infinite ability to just name and scream who we are from the top of our lungs.
Thank you for that. Wow. So, for those of you who are just joining us, welcome again. I'm speaking with the incredible Afro Guyanese poetess Saida Agostini about her debut collection from Allen Squire Publishing, Let the Dead In. And there are many reasons why I thought Saida would be an excellent first guest for this season of Bios and Bookmarks, which, as you'll know, is about the complexity of Caribbean love. One of them is because love, as a concept, as a practice, and as a distinctly Caribbean possibility for all of us, exists in multiple forms across this collection. We've just spoken about the importance of seeking joy, pleasure, and satisfaction in love. But it's equally true that Saida's poems don't shy away from love's darkness, its complications, and the ways in which these things are often deeply rooted in the domestic. The speakers of these poems, Saida, do not shy away from naming the ways in which violences are often meted out against children at the
Mm-hmm.
hands of a maternal figure,
Mm-hmm.
or also the ways in which a paternal figure's repeated and injurious infidelities damages the psyche of the woman he has ostensibly promised to cherish and honor. Could we discuss a bit about how writing and weaving the domestic either opened you to new possibilities of exploring Caribbean love or showed you something in this process that was previously unknown to you, perhaps?
Mm-hmm. I think, it was interesting. I mean, even seeing my father's own evolution, right? I feel like, when he was younger, he had signed up for like what he had been taught, men should be, this idea, that, adultery was okay and that you can kind of like treat women any kind of way. And for us, I think, well, let me not speak for my sister, but one of the things I'll say is that in writing these poems, I had so much grief, not just for me and my mom, but like also for my father. Because what I started to recognize is how much of like these lessons around what masculinity is shaped how each of us showed up in these situations. We were babies, we didn't know, right? Um, but when I started to hear more and more of not just what it was like for my parents, but also for my grandparents and my great grandparents, and how much kind of these stories of like infidelity and emotional abuse were passed down. And then learning that Guyana has some of the highest rates of domestic violence in the entire Caribbean, a lot of things started to kind of weave together for me. I think it was also kind of why I have a whole series of poems about Chickenfoot, which is kind of my exploration of like Guyanese men, right? And thinking about how much, in my experience and seeing my family, like tenderness was not welcome or accepted in men, right? Um, and I think for me in these poems and what I'm most interested in is how do we get to a place where we can embrace simultaneity, where we can embrace kind of the tenderness that we all have access to and we all have a right to, right?
The Chickenfoot suite of poems is so incredibly moving. I'm pleased you brought that up because Chickenfoot remains, after now multiple readings of the collection, a person to me in whom I feel deeply invested. I confess I've thought about this person and wondered how are they in the fullness of their self and in their life. Perhaps the poem from that section that stays with me the most ardently is the one in which Chickenfoot is, on the one hand, surrendering himself to erotic encounters with a fellow boy named Reginald, and then when other boys confront this same sex desire, in Chickenfoot and Reginald, the reprisal is very violent.
Mm-hmm.
And Chickenfoot is conscripted into this violence in a way that deeply wounds him, even as he wounds his young lover. And it made me think about another line in another of your poems in which the speaker confronts the idea of what it would be like to live in Guyana in contemporaneity as a queer Black woman. What would it mean to feel potentially so isolated? To know that the only lesbian of that speaker's acquaintance is a woman boxer.
Mm-hmm.
And these explorations of the differences in queer identity across the Caribbean and its diaspora made me want to ask you what, both as a poet and an activist and a person, you hope for the queer future and the embodiment of that queer future in our literatures, not just for Guyana, but for the whole Caribbean, and how you see yourself placed in our current, I think, very strong canon of contemporary queer Caribbean writers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's so interesting. So when I got the grant to come to Guyana for a month, I reached out to the local LGBTQ society, and my parents were very much like, "Be careful, you could get killed, don't be out, like no one talks about sexuality." And I was like, well, that just doesn't necessarily seem fully connected because I just saw Guyana had like its second pride. So, like where's the truth, right? And I had some folks who generously agreed to like meet with me and talk with me. And I had a little bit of my parents' warning in my mind, and I'm like, oh my God, like, because they were being so open and out. It was a lesbian couple, and they were kissing each other. And I was like, so it's safe to do that there? And they were like, I can't suck my teeth very well. But they were like, child, please. Like, and so I think, the reality is so much more complicated than I think what we often carry in our heads, right? And I think my hope and prayer for where, kind of what I hope for queer Caribbean folks is that, particularly for those of us in the diaspora, that when we come home, we can come home without fear. Because Guyana is home for me. It's where my parents are from. It's, I have so much pride in the ways in which like Black and brown folks in Guyana have like organized and struggled. And I want to know I'm a part of that too, right? And I think my role, like within kind of all of this really amazing writing and thinking that's coming out of queer Caribbean writers, is to kind of wave the banner of pleasure and celebration and honor our elders. Like I hope and pray that like my great grannies and my great grandfathers and all those who came before me are looking down and knowing that I'm doing everything in my power to make sure that they're honored.
That's so beautiful. I think it's something that so many of us can relate to, the idea of wanting to be someone who carries forth their lineage with a real self-assurance and self-knowing, but also with authenticity. As you said, and during our conversation, you are not, as I expect or suspect many of us are not, the ideal dream of the perfect heterosexual, uh, conventionally employed child or descendant,
Mm-hmm.
and yet you are committed in your art and your practice telling the truth about entire generations of the people who made you and who shaped you. And as your collection shows, with incredible virtuosity, that also includes the voices of Black America, and the section of your book that gives voice to, yes, but also complicates the narratives we've been fed by traditional media about
Mm-hmm.
Black murdered bodies and souls in in the United States is deeply moving. It's enraging in all the ways that a good protest poem should make you feel. And it's also layered with tenderness. And it is a true collection of so many of these people who should still be with us. And whether you are discussing Ricky Lloyd's hair or reflecting with real ire on the fact that Daniel Holtzclaw's victims were who they were, there's, again, an unflinchingness, a refusal to look away from the page and from what these acts of violence have wrought. And I wanted to know how you worked to find the love in those situations amidst writing about such violence and such hatred.
I think it stays with me, the love, because it could be I hate saying it could have been, because it still could be me, right? When I think about the stories of folks like Brescia Meadows, a young Black girl who killed her father in self-defense, or the story of Rekia Boyd being shot by errant police gunfire, and having her weave sent home to her family. I think about the lack of care for Black women, femmes, and non-binary people. And so, I remember when I heard about Sandra Bland, and just the fear that I had. I was talking with a friend and I started crying, and I was like, this isn't how I'd want to be remembered. I don't think this is how she wants to be remembered, right? I don't want to be remembered for the way that I'm killed. I want to be remembered for how I live, right? And so a lot of those poems came from that, a love for the way that so many of these women live their lives. When you think about, for example, I read about Recy Taylor. Recy Taylor was a Black woman who was gang raped by a group of white men in the Deep South in the late 1930s or early 1940s. And she actually took them to trial. She took her rapist to trial. And I wanted to celebrate that. I wanted to celebrate the ways that these folks stood up and claimed their humanity, even when other folks refused to see it. How could you not love that? How could you not love the legacy that leaves for us?
That movement of poems, and in fact, the poems across the entire collection are deeply invested in the Black girl and the Black woman's humanity, yes, and also her divinity. You make all of these startling and, in some cases, astonishingly beautiful parallels between what makes a woman a divine, not just a divine creation, but a vessel of that divinity, which I think is a powerful counterpoint to all the ways in which Black women, Caribbean and otherwise, have been taught not to love themselves. And if we're talking about complex love as we are today, there can perhaps be no love more complex than the Black Caribbean woman's pursuit of her own godhood through the mire of just institutional, historical, societal, cultural hatred she's been made to swallow. And again, like in what feels like a stylistic, emotional anaphora, you present us with poems that do this. Did you come to, in this process, a different understanding or an augmented understanding of the God concept within yourself as a Black Caribbean woman?
That's such a deep question. I don't know. I think I will say this. So I think a lot of these poems became inspired by two kind of discrete things. One, I have a couple of family members. I never met them. They passed away before I was born, who said that they were kidnapped by mermaids.
Wow.
Right? Yeah. And then even fascinatingly enough, my dad's grandmother, my dad's mom, and who my favorite person in the whole world, my granny, told me that her father stopped drinking because he saw a mermaid and the old hag. And he was like, that's it. That's time. No more drinking to be done. And then around that same time, when I came to Guyana, I had the pleasure of meeting with a mythologist at the University of Guyana named Old Man Poppy. And he said something to me that has never left me. He said that mythology in Guyana, and I would argue could be extrapolated to all of the Caribbean, was created to subject and oppress Black and Brown people. Right. And when you think about it, right, like, so for example, the water baby, the mermaids, rivers are the best way to escape. Right. But if you're being told as an enslaved person, there are murderous water people who will grab you and eat you. And also, if that doesn't work, they will suffocate you. You may not leave by the water, right? You will try to find another way to leave. And so, I became really interested in like exploring these archetypes in ways that celebrated their femininity, that celebrated their power as women. And I think that really shifted how I also was seeing myself, right? Like, so what if the old hag reveled in her power as she like left her skin at night and like flew over the water in a ring of fire? All of those things like just felt really excited to me. And, I think honestly, we are divine. We need to create the works that centers our divinity because no one else will.
I think that is a perfect note, Saida, to invite you to do your second reading for us. Please bless us with a final poem before we move on to the exciting, fun segment of bios and bookmarks. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. So I'm actually going to read The Old Hag Goes Hunting. Legend holds that I am ugly and stooped, covered in frightful disdain. But rather I glory in my own sight. Naked, black, wrinkled flesh, breasts low-hanging ripe fruit, my sex a shining damp shell. At nights while you slumber, I go flying crowned in blue fire above the Mahaika, my skin left sleeping in bed. There are those who would argue my midnight visits spur madness, report of women who cut machetes as they would my breasts and do a violence to my men. I say, the taste of me intoxicates, bewitches my beloveds to cut what keeps them tethered and sighing, toiling in heat for a man that does no good. In truth, this way is no easier. Boys spread white salt and rice and strict lines to bar me from my own skin. My own beloved shy with fear when they first see me. But then I reach out my hand, hold them to my chest, and sing the history of old Black women digging and crafting this ancient earth into consciousness. I say, this is yours, take it. And they come, shuddering with power. Thank you.
Thank you for that. It's been a revelation and an education and a joy speaking with you. But we're not done yet. As everyone who's ever seen an episode of Bios and Bookmarks knows, we won't let our guests leave, in the best possible way, of course, without playing an interactive game with them. And we're delighted to announce a new game for this season of Bios and Bookmarks in step, we think, with our theme, the complexity of Caribbean love. This season segment is called Walking to the Revolution, and it envisages the following scenario. So, Saida, your new book is on its way to a life-changing protest, held in honor of the social and political issue closest to your heart. Let the Dead In is walking hand in hand down the street with two other books by its side. Books that are in intense and catalytic conversation with it.
Yes, so those books would be Malika Booker's Pepper Seed and Diamond Ford's The Mother Body.
I am fortunate to know both of those books fairly well, but I'd love to hear a bit more about why you've chosen them. Why are they good companions to let the dead in?
Sure. So Malika Booker's The Mother Body. I'm sorry, Malika Booker's Pepper Seed. Honestly, because I read it when it first came out, and it was the first time that I saw a Guyanese poet break all the rules that I thought we had to observe about being a good Caribbean woman, right? So here was this woman who was rocket, who had a voice that was raucous and wild and saucy and sensual and brilliant, and unabashed in who she was, right? And so the pepper seed really offered me a blueprint to follow about how to break this mold that I had put myself in. The Mother Body by Diamond Ford, because The Mother Body is a book that is so revelatory. It's about pleasure and black bodies and really entering into yourself in a way that loves on fatness, that loves on pleasure, loves on orgasms, and also explores the complication of loving yourself as a fat black woman in a world that doesn't always love you.
That's brilliant, and I wonder what kind of protest these three books are going to. But I'm sure that wherever it is, it's something rooted in the Caribbean and
Mhm.
rooted in a celebration of divine womanhood.
Pretty much, yeah. It would be first to a line. It would be it would be a resistance party. It would be a resistance line. And it would be, a pro LGBTQ, reproductive justice, anti colonialism march.
That's perfect. I too would like to attend. I as we close off this first episode of season 8 of Bios and Bookmarks, I want to give a special thank you to Saida's publishers, Allen Squire Publishing, for providing a complimentary copy of Let the Dead In for our first ever Bios and Bookmarks giveaway. That's right, one fortunate recipient who tunes in to all 6 episodes this season will receive all 6 books sent directly to them when the season concludes. All you have to do to be eligible for a draw is to leave a comment during our live stream. And at the end of the season, all your comments will be entered. And hopefully, fingers crossed, you'll be walking away with all 6 books. But even if you aren't, please check out Saida's book, Let the Dead In, and order it. One for yourself, one for your favorite goddess, one for your favorite family member. As you've heard, this book will keep you exceptional company, and it will show you all sorts of ways to reclaim and to declaim and to be present in the most astonishing and empowering love. Saida, I can't thank you enough for joining us to debut this season, and I look forward intensely to the work you write in the future.
Thank you so much. This was just really a joy. I could do this with you every week.
I wish we could. In some other parallel dimension of queer female divinity, that's exactly what we're doing. So I'm Shivanee Ramlochan. It's been my pleasure to be with all of you to re-welcome Bios and Bookmarks, powered by the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. Please join us next week for our next guest and guest host. Until then, take care and have phenomenal adventures in reading.